Dawn broke over the Yukon with a muted glow, painting the snow in soft shades of pink and gold. The forest stood frozen in perfect stillness, every branch heavy with ice, every breath of wind a whisper. It was the kind of morning when nothing should stir except the faint rustle of a raven's wings. But something was moving. From the small wooden porch of a weathered cabin, 80 yards from the tree line, Robert Hale squinted into the distance. The retired park ranger had lived here for over 20 years. His only company, the quiet hum of the stove inside, and his old Malinois, Shadow, sprawled lazily at his feet. Shadow was no ordinary dog. At 12 years old, his muzzle was streaked with gray, and his eyes held the cool focus of an animal who had seen too much. Once, he had patrolled the wild alongside Robert, tracking poachers and searching for lost hikers. Now, his world was smaller morning walks, slow patrols around the cabin, and naps by the fire. That morning, Shadow lifted his head before Robert did. His ears pricked, his body stiffened. "What is it, boy?" Robert followed his gaze. A small, uneven shape stumbled through the snow beyond the first ring of pines. At first, Robert thought it was a fox kit until the sunlight caught the tufted tips of its ears. "Lynx," he murmured, reaching for his binoculars. The animal was barely bigger than a house cat, its spotted fur matted with ice, each step faltering. Even from here, Robert could see it was young, far too young to be alone. It collapsed once, tried to rise, and fell again. Shadow was already on his feet. Robert frowned. "Easy, boy. Let's not spook it." But the Malinois trotted into the snow, ignoring the command. He moved with surprising speed for his age, a dark shadow cutting across the white, until he reached the fallen cub. Robert could just make out the scene. Shadow sniffing, circling, then unexpectedly lowering himself into the snow beside the lynx, curling his body around it like a living wall. The cub didn't run. It didn't even flinch. It pressed against the dog's warmth, trembling. Robert lowered the binoculars slowly. This wasn't normal. Wild lynx cubs avoided dogs, and dogs, especially seasoned working dogs, kept their distance from wild cats. But here they were, two silhouettes in the snow, breathing together. He grabbed his coat and started toward them. By the time he reached them, the cub's eyes were still closed, its sides heaving in shallow breaths. Shadow glanced up briefly, as if to say, "This one's mine now." Robert knelt in the snow, brushing frost from the cub's fur. Its ears were chilled to the touch, its paws raw from ice. It was too weak to fight, too tired to care. "Poor little thing," Robert murmured. He looked at Shadow. "Guess we're not walking away from this one, huh?" Shadow didn't move, only adjusted himself so the cub was tucked deeper under his chest. Robert hesitated. He knew the rules. Wild animals weren't pets. They belonged in the wild, or with rehab specialists. But looking at the half-dead cub, pressed into the warmth of his old partner, Robert knew there was no time for phone calls or permits. If they left it here, it wouldn't survive another hour. "All right," he sighed, lifting the cub gently into his arms. Shadow followed without a word, his eyes locked on the fragile bundle. Back inside the cabin, the fire roared, filling the room with heat. Robert set the cub down on a folded blanket near the hearth. Shadow lay beside it immediately, resting his head close enough that the cub's whiskers brushed his fur. The lynx gave a faint, broken sound, not a meow, not a growl, just a plea. Robert stood back, watching the dog and the wild thing breathe in sync. "Why you, Shadow?" he muttered. "Why this one?" Neither answered. But something about that moment, the warmth, the silence, the trust, felt like the beginning of something Robert hadn't seen in years. A story worth remembering. The fire cracked softly, sending shadows flickering across the cabin walls. Robert knelt beside the small bundle on the blanket. The cub, no, the lynx, was frighteningly still. Its breathing was shallow, the rise and fall barely visible beneath the tattered fur. Shadow hovered nearby, his nose brushing the cub's side every few seconds, as if checking to make sure it was still alive. Robert gently rubbed its ears, trying to bring warmth back into them. Poor little guy. You've been out there too long. He kept a small medical kit for Shadow antiseptic, gauze, a thermometer. Now, his hands moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd patched up too many injured animals over the years. The cub's paws were cracked, its fur tangled with burrs and ice. When Robert pressed his fingers lightly against its ribs, he felt every bone. Shadow made a low sound, half growl, half whine. "I know," Robert murmured. "We'll help him." He filled a small syringe with warm goat's milk left over from a neighbor's farm and eased the tip toward the cub's mouth. At first, nothing. Then, a weak twitch of its whiskers. A flick of the tongue. "That's it. Come on," Robert urged. The cub swallowed, slow and unsteady, but enough. Shadow's tail gave one slow wag. His eyes locked on the tiny creature, as if the act of drinking was the most important thing in the world. Then, unexpectedly, the cub let out a tiny sneeze, sending a droplet of milk straight onto Shadow's nose. The old dog blinked, then calmly licked it off. Robert couldn't help but chuckle. "Guess we're not wasting a drop, huh?" The next hours were long. The cub would wake briefly, drink a little, then sink back into a restless half-sleep. Sometimes it whimpered, a pitiful sound that made Shadow lift his head instantly. Late that night, Robert dozed in his chair by the fire, waking to the sound of claws on the wooden floor. Shadow was nudging one of his old rope toys toward the blanket. He dropped it beside the cub and sat upright, ears forward, as if awaiting a grand reaction. The cub stirred, sniffed weakly at the toy, then flopped forward, draping one paw over it like it was a treasure. Shadow's ears twitched in approval. Robert smiled. "Look at that. First gift accepted." Ebbed. By morning, the cub's eyes had opened for the first time since Robert had seen it. They were golden, clear but wary, darting between the man and the dog. Shadow was the first thing it truly focused on. The lynx blinked, tilted its head, then shuffled forward until its forehead bumped lightly into Shadow's chest. Robert exhaled slowly. Well, I guess he's chosen his company. The day passed with small signs of improvement. The cub, whom Robert had started calling Rune after the strange, rune-like marking above its right eye, managed to sit up and even take a few unsteady steps across the blanket. At one point, Rune tripped over Shadow's tail and collapsed right on top of it. Shadow froze, eyes flicking to Robert as if asking for permission to move. Robert shook his head, grinning. "Don't you dare wake him now." When Robert opened the cabin door to fetch more wood, Rune's ears flicked at the sudden gust of icy air. He froze, then darted behind Shadow's legs, peeking out only when the door shut again. "Looks like you're his bodyguard now," Robert said. That night, as the wind howled outside, Rune stirred restlessly in his sleep. Shadow rose, circled, and then curled around him, his nose tucked under the lynx's chin. Robert sat at the table, watching the scene with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. This wasn't just survival anymore. Something else was taking root: trust, maybe even something like love. But Robert knew the rules. Rune was a wild animal. The authorities would expect him to hand the cub over to a wildlife center. The longer it stayed here, the harder that would be for all of them. He leaned back, staring at the fire. "We're just keeping him alive until he's ready to go, that's all," he said aloud, as if trying to convince himself. Shadow didn't look up. Rune shifted slightly, his tiny paw resting on the dog's leg. And Robert realized, with a quiet sinking in his chest, that none of them might be ready when the time came. By the second week, Robert had stopped counting how many nights the lynx cub had slept in front of his fire. Rune had grown stronger. He could now walk steadily across the cabin floor without stumbling. His coat had fluffed out, revealing the bold black spots and the tall, tufted ears that marked him as a true lynx. But his eyes, golden and alert, were almost always locked on Shadow. Shadow, in turn, had shifted into a role Robert hadn't seen in years. He wasn't just guarding anymore, he was teaching. It started with small things. Shadow would stand by the cabin door at sunrise, ready for his slow patrol. Rune, curious, would follow, his paws pattering on the wooden floor. Robert watched one morning as the lynx squeezed between Shadow's legs, peering out at the snow like a soldier on his first mission. When Shadow stepped outside, Rune followed, then immediately froze as his paws sank into the cold powder. His expression was unmistakable. Betrayal. Robert laughed so hard he had to steady himself against the wall. Shadow glanced back, waited, then took 2 deliberate steps forward. Rune mimicked him, ears flat, clearly offended but determined not to be left behind. By the time they returned, Rune was bounding through the snow like a pup, pouncing on invisible prey and sending sprays of powder into the air. Shadow watched him for a while before trotting into the cabin. Rune followed a moment later, trailing half the forest floor in his fur. Robert groaned. Guess who's not helping me clean that up? The bond deepened in ways Robert didn't expect. One morning, he left the front door slightly ajar while carrying in firewood. Rune darted out before he could stop him. "Rune!" Robert called, bracing for the chase, but Shadow was already moving. He bounded outside, cut off the lynx's path, and herded him back toward the door. Rune hissed once, then trotted inside, clearly annoyed. "Looks like we've got a shepherd in the house," Robert said, scratching Shadow's ear. The teaching went both ways. Rune had an instinct for climbing, and Shadow didn't. Robert came into the cabin one afternoon to find Rune perched smugly on top of the tall bookshelf, tail twitching. Shadow was pacing below, barking in short, sharp bursts. "What's the matter, old boy? He's fine up there." Shadow wasn't convinced. He barked again, louder this time. Rune, clearly enjoying the performance, leapt down not onto the floor, but directly onto Shadow's back. The dog froze, eyes wide, while Robert nearly dropped the mug in his hand from laughing. "You two are gonna kill me," he said. There were quieter moments, 2 moments, that told Robert this wasn't just survival anymore. At night, Rune would curl up against Shadow, one paw always resting on the dog's leg. Sometimes, Shadow would lower his head to rest on Rune's back, their breathing falling into sync within minutes. Once, during a late winter storm, the wind rattled the cabin windows so hard that Rune jolted awake, eyes wide. Shadow rose instantly, pressed his side against the lynx, and let out a deep, slow exhale. Rune's ears flicked once, then he relaxed. "That's not just instinct," Robert murmured from his chair. "That's love." Then came the day Rune tried to howl. It was early evening, and a coyote call had drifted in from the far ridge. Shadow lifted his head and answered with a long, steady howl that seemed to shake the air. Rune, watching closely, tilted his head, then opened his mouth. The sound that came out was absurd, part squeak, part mule, part croak. Robert nearly choked on his coffee. Shadow froze for a moment, then let out a low, rumbling howl again, encouraging him. Rune tried once more, this time producing something closer to a yowl, but still comically wrong. Shadow wagged his tail. Robert grinned. "Don't worry, kid. You'll get there." From that day, Rune practiced. Sometimes at sunrise, sometimes randomly in the middle of the night, waking Robert from his sleep. The sound wasn't pretty, but each time it got a little less feline, a little more canine. It was in these moments between the quiet lessons, the clumsy imitations, the shared warmth that Robert realized he was witnessing something rare. A dog nearing the twilight of his life and a lynx cub just learning what it meant to live had met in the cold heart of winter and chosen each other. And Robert, for all his years as a ranger, knew he might never see anything like it again. By the time the spring sun began to soften the Yukon snow, Rune had transformed. The once frail cub was now nearly as tall as Shadow at the shoulder. His body lean but strong, his coat thick and shining in the light. He had the build of a predator, but the heart, that was something else entirely. One crisp morning, Robert stood on the porch sipping his coffee as Shadow pushed the cabin door open with his nose. Rune padded out right behind him, his tufted ears perked, his tail flicking with excitement. Robert chuckled. Morning patrol again? The pair set off down the familiar path toward the river. Shadow walked with calm, measured steps. Rune, on the other hand, zigzagged from snowbank to snowbank, pouncing at invisible enemies. Halfway to the river, Rune spotted a squirrel and froze, his body low to the ground, every muscle coiled. He crept forward in perfect silence, until Shadow barked once, loudly. The squirrel vanished into the trees. Rune turned his head, ears flat, glaring at the dog. Robert laughed out loud. Guess your dad's not much of a hunting partner, huh? Back at the cabin, the discoveries continued. Rune had found his way onto the roof not once, but twice by leaping from a nearby pine. Shadow, seeing him perched up there, stood at the base barking nonstop, like he was summoning the fire department. When Robert opened the window to scold them, Rune peered over the edge, then without warning leapt straight onto Shadow's back. The dog staggered under the weight, gave Robert a wide-eyed look, and then simply walked inside with the lynx still riding him like a king on a horse. Robert shook his head. You two are going to make me famous for all the wrong reasons. Inside, Rune's antics didn't stop. One afternoon, Robert laid out a small training exercise for Shadow, an old treat puzzle from his working days. Before Shadow could start, Rune trotted up, sniffed it, and promptly flipped the whole thing over with one paw, sending treats spilling across the floor. Shadow stared at the mess, then at Rune. Rune, unfazed, began eating the treats one by one. Shadow sighed, lay down beside him, and waited his turn. Sharing, that's progress, Robert muttered. Not all changes were funny. Some were more complicated. Rune had begun wandering farther from the cabin. At first, it was just a few yards beyond the tree line, but lately, Robert had spotted him up on the ridge, scanning the valley below. Shadow always followed, herding him back with a firm shoulder bump or a sharp bark. Rune would come, but not without a lingering glance toward the horizon. Robert didn't like the look in his eyes. There was curiosity there, and something older, instinct. Still, their bond was unshakable. When Robert went down to the river to check his traps, Shadow would lie in the grass, and Rune would flop down beside him, rolling onto his back in a rare display of trust. Shadow would lean over, sniff his belly, and nudge him upright. Sometimes, Rune returned the gesture in his own way, grooming Shadow's ears with slow, deliberate licks. Shadow tolerated it for about 10 seconds before shaking his head and walking away, which only made Robert laugh harder. Then came the first howl of spring. It started as a long, deep call from Shadow, echoing off the mountains. Rune, sitting beside him on the ridge, tilted his head, ears forward. He took a deep breath and Misera. It came out somewhere between a rusty door hinge and a cat with a hairball. Robert, who'd been watching from below, nearly dropped the bucket in his hand. That was terrible, he called up. Shadow, however, seemed pleased. He howled again. Rune tried once more, less terrible this time. They kept going, a strange duet of canine resonance and feline rasp, until Robert's sides hurt from laughing. By summer, Rune had become a fixture in Robert's daily life. The old ranger couldn't fetch firewood without Rune padding after him. He couldn't open the fridge without two sets of eyes, one amber, one brown, watching intently. It was hard to imagine the cabin without them. And yet, Robert knew enough about the wild to see the signs. Rune was faster now, quieter, his muscles tightening in ways that had nothing to do with play. He would stalk birds, freeze at distant sounds, and sometimes disappear for an hour before reappearing from the trees, tail twitching like he'd been on a secret mission. The lynx in him was waking up. Shadow seemed to sense it too. On those days, Robert would find the old dog lying closer to the door, as if ready to follow at a moment's notice. Still, at night, nothing had changed. Rune would curl beside Shadow, one paw draped over the dog's leg. Shadow would shift slightly, tucking his head near Rune's shoulder, and Robert, watching from his chair, would feel that familiar mix of warmth and dread, the knowledge that this, like all good things, couldn't last forever. The first sign came quietly. Rune stopped following Shadow one morning. Instead of bounding to the door at sunrise, he sat by the window, staring toward the ridge. His ears twitched, catching sounds Robert couldn't hear. Shadow barked once, a low, questioning sound. Rune didn't move. Robert, watching from the kitchen, felt a pang in his chest. "You're hearing something out there, aren't you?" He knew what it meant. The wild was calling. Over the next week, Rune began to drift. He roamed farther each day, sometimes disappearing for hours. When he returned, there was a different look in his eyes, alert, restless, and hard to read. His hunting changed too. No more clumsy pounces. Now he moved like a ghost, silent and deliberate. Once, when Shadow approached a fresh kill, Rune gave a low growl. It was quick, almost embarrassed, but it made Robert freeze. The lynx was growing into his nature, and nature had a way of pulling things apart. Then came the storm. It rolled in without warning, thunder cracking over the mountains, rain whipping sideways through the trees. The wind tore branches from the pines and sent the river into a frenzy. Robert was stacking wood when he realized Rune wasn't inside. He called once, twice, stepping onto the porch. Nothing. Shadow was already pacing at the door, whining, muscles tight. Robert didn't need to say a word. The dog bolted into the storm, Robert following with his raincoat barely zipped. They found him near the old creek bed, trapped beneath a fallen pine limb. Rune's flank was streaked with blood, his back leg bent at an unnatural angle. His eyes were wide, wild with pain and fear. He hissed when Shadow approached, but only for a moment. Recognition flashed, and the fight drained from him. Shadow moved in, bracing his body against the log, shoving with all the strength his aging frame could muster. The limb shifted just enough for Rune to pull free, collapsing against the dog's side. Rain poured over them, but Shadow didn't move until Rune was upright, if barely. Then, lowering himself, he let the lynx climb onto his back. Robert caught up just in time to see the two figures, dog carrying lynx, moving through the sheets of rain, step by deliberate step, back toward the cabin light. The next 3 days were a blur. Rune's wound was cleaned and bandaged, his leg splinted. Robert sat up most nights, changing compresses and keeping the fire blazing. Shadow stayed at Rune's side, barely eating, only leaving to drink before returning to his post. Sometimes, Rune would stir and let out a low, pained sound. Shadow would press his head gently to the lynx's neck until he settled again. On the third night, the storm finally broke. Robert was drifting in and out of sleep when he heard it. A howl. Not Shadow's. It was rougher, higher, but steady. Rune, lying on his side, head lifted toward the window, was howling into the dark. Shadow joined in, their voices weaving together a strange, beautiful duet that filled the cabin and spilled out into the clearing. Robert sat still, listening. It wasn't just a call, it was a promise. The next morning, a ranger truck pulled into the drive. It was Ethan, one of Robert's old colleagues. He'd heard rumors about a lynx living with a dog and had come to see for himself. One look at Rune's bandaged leg, and Ethan shook his head. He's not fit for the wild anymore. Not the way he's bonded to you two, but keeping a lynx without a permit, that's a problem. Robert's stomach sank. So what happens? Ethan hesitated. There's a sanctuary 2 hours south. Big enclosure, semi-wild, plenty of space. You could visit, but he'd be theirs. Shadow seemed to understand the shift in tone. He stepped between Rune and Ethan, his hackles raised just enough to make the message clear. Robert sighed. Let's think about it. Ethan left the paperwork on the table. The rain had stopped, but the cabin felt quieter than usual. Rune slept most of the afternoon, Shadow curled protectively around him. Robert knew the decision couldn't wait forever, and he wasn't sure which would be harder, letting Rune go or trying to keep him. Ethan returned a week later. This time, Robert was ready. Rune's leg was healing well. He could limp from the hearth to the door without Shadow's help, though the dog still insisted on walking beside him, shoulder brushing shoulder. Robert had made his decision. "I'll sign the papers," he told Ethan, "but only if Shadow comes with him." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "They'll take them both. The sanctuary's not just for wildcats, they've got rescues of all kinds, and they'd be together." And 2 weeks later, Robert loaded the truck. A folded blanket, a bag of Shadow's favorite treats, and a small tin box that held the rope toy Rune had claimed as his own. The sanctuary was bigger than Robert expected. Acres of pines, a winding stream, and tall wooden fencing that blended almost seamlessly into the forest. The director, a kind-faced woman named Claire, led them to a large enclosure, dotted with logs, climbing platforms, and sunlit patches of grass. "This is home now," Claire said gently. "For as long as they need." The gate opened. Shadow trotted in first, sniffing the air. Rune followed, ears forward, moving cautiously at first, then breaking into a low, rolling bound toward a fallen log. He leapt onto it in one smooth motion, turning to watch Shadow explore the grass below. Robert stood by the gate for a long time. He thought the goodbye would come as a single moment, but it didn't. It came in pieces, Shadow pausing to glance back, Rune circling closer before darting off again, the warmth of fur against his palm for the last time. "You take care of each other?" Robert said quietly. Weeks passed. Robert visited often. Sometimes he brought treats, sometimes just his voice, calling their names from across the enclosure. Shadow would come loping, tail wagging. Rune, now fully healed, would appear from the trees with that confident, almost smug stride of his, brushing past Robert as if to say, "I'm fine, but I'm glad you're here." One autumn afternoon, Robert arrived to find Claire waiting with a grin. "Come see this," she said. Inside the enclosure, a small golden retriever pup was tumbling through the grass, chasing leaves. Shadow stood nearby, watching like a patient elder. Rune sat on a log above them, tail twitching in thought. Then, with a quiet leap, the lynx landed beside the pup. The dog froze, then wagged its tail uncertainly. Rune sniffed him once, twice, and then tapped him gently on the head with one paw. Shadow barked, Rune chirped, and the pup bounded forward, the three of them weaving through the grass like they'd been together forever. Robert felt something lift in his chest. "So that's the new kid, huh?" Claire nodded. "Guess your boys decided they were ready for an apprentice." And from then on, the visits were different. Robert didn't just see two animals who'd beaten the odds, he saw a family, one that had room to grow. Rune had stopped wandering to the far end of the enclosure alone. Shadow looked livelier with the pup darting between his legs. And the pup, well, he was learning quickly from two very unusual teachers. On a crisp winter morning, Robert stood by the fence as the sun rose. Shadow sat in the grass. Rune perched beside him. The pup sprawled between their paws. Shadow lifted his head and howled a deep, steady note that echoed through the pines. Rune joined in, his voice now rich and confident, somewhere between a lynx's call and a dog's song. The pup tilted his head, then let out a tiny, wobbly yip that made Robert laugh out loud. Three voices, imperfect but together, carried over the snow. There's a plaque now on the gate to their enclosure. It reads, "Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you cry." Robert didn't write it, one of the sanctuary volunteers did, but he couldn't think of truer words. As he turned to leave, the howls followed him down the path. They weren't sad. They weren't goodbyes. They were a greeting and a promise that some bonds, once forged, don't fade. They grow.